Hello, all of you. Um, so this is the part about conservation. We're going to talk about some issues regarding biodiversity conservation in Brazil. Okay. Um, we saw all the biomes, all the six biomes in Brazil. And we talked about the biodiversity and how it's distributed in space and also about the threats, the main threats, and today we're going to focus on the conservation initiatives. So first of all, I want to talk to you about the protected areas because it's a key component of conservation is the establishment of protected areas like national parks and biological reserves and so forth. The first national parks in Brazil were established in 1937. The first one was the Itatiaia National Park, which is in the state of Rio, very close to the city of Rio de Janeiro, actually. Is where it's a mountain area, high elevation area, um, reaching more than 2,500 meters of elevation. And that was the first park. At that time, Rio was the capital of Brazil, so Rio is the main point of the country. And so this park was very close to Rio. Is a touristic area. Okay, um, so that was the first park. And then a couple of years later, um, three other parks were established. Serra dos Ovos, which is very close to Itatiaia. It's also in the state of Rio, is another mountain chain, also a very uh, heavy area in terms of tourism since those times. And Iguaçu and Sete Quedas, which are adjacent to each other, were at least the Iguaçu National Park here at the border with Argentina, where the Iguaçu Falls are, and Sete Quedas, which is was actually the falls there were even larger than Iguaçu, but they were flooded in 1982 when they built the Itaipu hydroelectric power plant, and the lake just flooded the Sete Quedas area. So uh, it's not a park anymore; it's underwater. Um, and these four national parks were the only ones for a while. Then a few other areas were created in 1970. So more than 50 years ago, we had only 14 national parks and 27,500 square kilometers of protected areas, and many biomes were not even part of that. So in the late 1970s and especially in the 1980s, there was a concern that the country had to protect more areas, to assure that more areas were protected. And that also comes with a world movement of environmental protection, and which also reflected in Brazil. So in the 1970s and 80s, the federal government created some offices dedicated to the protection of the environment. And two of them were the IBDF, which is the acronym for the Brazilian Forestry Development Institute, and SEMA, which was the Secretariat for the Environment. Those are both federal offices, and together they managed to create many national parks and also in other kinds of protected areas like biological reserves and ecological stations. The difference between these categories is that, for instance, national parks are open to visitation to the public, um, and biological reserves and ecological stations are more controlled, and so in biological reserves, you do not have like tourism and this kind of activity. You only have scientific research, and you may have some perhaps environmental education activities, but no high-scale tourism, for example. And in 1989, they rearranged the environmental area and actually merged the former IBDF and SEMA, and also the Sudene, which was Sudepi, which was a fisheries institute, into IBAMA, which is the Brazilian Institute for the Environment, connected to the Ministry of the Environment. That was created in 1989, and IBAMA promoted the establishment of many new protected areas. The map here shows it's from 2016, shows the protected areas and also indigenous lands. Although indigenous lands were not created to protect biodiversity in terms of plants and animals, was created to protect the indigenous people who live there. They also protect biodiversity because the indigenous people need and use the biodiversity. So then you see here that most of the protected areas, and then here you have two different kinds of protected areas, which is full protection when you have a very controlled use of the area, and you cannot destroy the area. You cannot change the area to a different kind of land use. But you also have sustainable use areas, which are areas where you can have agriculture. People can own their own land, and so it's a more flexible protected area, so to speak. So you see that, but for both sustainable use and full protection areas, the Amazon has, and also indigenous lands, the Amazon has more than any other biome. Okay, you see that in the Atlantic forest, the areas are very small, usually, especially full protection areas are very small because the Atlantic forest fragments are usually very small. And so in the Cerrado, you have some large areas here, but usually they are not very large. And then the Caatinga too, our areas tend to be very small. You see in the Pampa, they're just one sustainable use area here, and there's one small full protection here on the coast. But the Pampa is really not protected, not well protected. The Pantanal is okay. You have some full protection areas, but also not that many. In 2000, the government established what we call the National Protected Areas System. So it's a system that integrates federal, state, and municipal protected areas, and even private areas. In the 1990s, they created what they called a private natural heritage reserve. In Portuguese, is RPPN is the acronym. Reserva Particular do Patrimônio Natural in Portuguese, which is also part of the National Protected Area System, the SNUC. Those are private areas that people want to protect and preserve. So the land still belongs to them. While they live, but they commit to never destroy that part of their property. Okay? That was a very interesting initiative, and hundreds of landowners actually created those protected private natural heritage reserves. So then with the creation of the system, you have a kind of an integrated system of protected areas. In 2007, the government decided to split IBAMA into two different offices. One is IBAMA itself, and the other is Chico Mendes Institute, which is ICMBio. And then the ICMBio is responsible for the protected areas, and the IBAMA is responsible for controlling and policing the deforestation and controlling deforestation, and applying fines to those who destroy the environment, and so it's more of enforcing the legislation on protection, and then the ICMBio is responsible for the system of protected areas. Okay. Um, so the establishment of protected areas is a very important way to save biodiversity. But one problem is that you really have to protect the areas. So sometimes many of those areas are, as we say, protected on paper, but not. So there is a a nice official document saying that this area is delimited and it's protected, but very often when you go there, especially the large areas in the Amazon, you go there, there's no, delimitation on the ground, there's no fence, there's nothing, showing that this area here is protected. There's like, a few um, park rangers and people to actually prevent people from entering, from destroying, or from doing anything, or from hunting, or collecting, or specimens for illegal trafficking and so forth. So enforcing the areas is and actually to make that work is harder than it looks. So although we have many protected areas, many of them are still need to be uh, put into action, to have really, to be really delimited, and also to educate people about it, so people who live nearby know that that's a protected area. Sometimes people don't even know that's a protected area. So that's a major point that has to be enforced. But it's a first step. I used to think that it was kind of worth, wasn't worth it, creating areas that are not real in terms of being there. But actually, it's better than nothing. I mean, if you have some legislation that protects that area, even if people go there and destroy or cut trees, or do something that they should not be doing, at least you have ways to argue against that. Okay, so that's a first step. When you look at the strict protection versus the sustainable development areas, as I mentioned before, so about 1/3 of the protected areas are strict protection. So ecological station, biological reserve, and national or state or municipal parks. Okay, so these are areas that control the flow of people and the activities that can be done there. Whereas these categories here allow, especially the environmental protection area, this is, in here, the land is owned by the government. It's a public land. Okay, the land has to be purchased by the government if people still live there. And here it doesn't. So this maybe, you have farms, you can have even cities, or other uses there, but somehow controlled. Okay, you can do some stuff, but not anything, not everything. Um, and then you have also some reserves for extraction of natural products, and for um, what we call national or state forests. Okay, and also some areas for sustainable development reserves, which are very interesting because you get the community involved in using and protecting the biodiversity of the area. Um, as we saw on the map, most protected areas are in the Amazon. So in terms of area, 77% of the protected areas are in the Amazon. Um, the second biome is the Cerrado, and then the Atlantic Forest, and then the Caatinga, and then Pantanal and Pampa have very small protected areas, very small amount of protected areas. They're small, so but even then, they should have more than what they have. Here, when we compare strict protection and sustainable use, you see that, so in the Amazon, you have, in all biomes, actually, you have more sustainable use areas, so areas that you can actually use, than strictly protected areas. Okay. In the Pantanal is a bit different, but that's just because the Pantanal National Park is basically what's protected there. Okay. Um, and you see that the Pampa has a very small area that's per percentage that's under strict protection, which is the one park that I mentioned before. Also, Caatinga has a small proportion of strictly protected areas. Another initiative that's important for conservation is the endangered species lists, or so that creates a legislation that protects um, plants and animals officially from from hunting, from collecting, and any other activities. Um, One thing that's important to say is that in Brazil, a law was established in 1967, which is called the Fauna Protection Law, the law of the protection of animals. Um, and it forbids hunting. Okay, so hunting is illegal in Brazil, and basically hunting of any native species. Okay, so basically native species of animals in Brazil are belong to the government. That's basically the idea. So you can, and even if you have your own, like you say, you have your own farm, your own area of forest, the animals that are there are not yours. So you cannot just go there and kill an animal, even a common animal. In terms of the law, that's against the law. Of course, people do that and people hunt, but that's illegal. Okay, but that happens, but that's illegal since 1967. That's one important point. In 1968, they wrote the first list of plants and animals that were then considered to be under threat. Okay, this list had 86 species of plants and animals. This was done by some pioneers of conservation, people who just, saw that, some plants and animals, especially animals, plants were very few at the time, were disappearing, and then they started to call attention to that. That was a very kind of a first, very, how can I say, it wasn't as like a scientific analysis or anything like that. Just people like felt that these species needed protection because they were their numbers were reducing drastically. Okay. Since then, we made a huge progress. Okay, so today, even in Brazil, when we do national evaluations or even state evaluations, we use the categories that were consolidated by the International Union of for the Conservation of Nature (IUCN). Those were established, many years ago after many discussions. Although they were conceived to do this analysis in terms of globally for all species for species, in the whole world, you can adapt them to local or regional analysis. Okay, so you have basically there's like three categories of threatened species. So if a species is threatened, it can fall into three categories: vulnerable, endangered, and critically endangered. Okay, vulnerable is uh, the best or the 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 mild scenario. Endangered and then critically endangered is the worst scenario for threatened species. Okay, then you have near threatened. So those are species that are close to being threatened but are not there yet. Then you have least concerned species, so species that are common and we shouldn't be concerned about them, at least today. Then you have the extinct species. Okay, so they might be regionally extinct, so they might be extinct in Brazil, but they might live in Argentina or Colombia or another country, or they may be extinct in the wild, but you still have some populations in zoos or botanical gardens, or they may be really extinct. So that's gone. Okay, no living individual of that species. And then all of these is when you have data to evaluate, because to be considered threatened in any of the categories or even near threatened, there's certain criteria that you have to meet. Okay, so the population has to be declining, or there's like only very few individuals left, or there might be some a disease that has decimated populations recently, or the habitat might be under really strong pressure and destruction. So there's but the it's a very scientific and numerical approach. Okay, so and it's you have to meet the criteria to be placed here. You cannot just, okay, I think that the golden lion tamarin is a rare animal, and then I think it's in there. No, it doesn't work like that. You have to evaluate, you have to look at the data, you have to use maps, use population data, use ecological data to place them in the category. Okay. Um, Sometimes you don't have enough data to do that. So those are things that we call data deficient. Okay, species that you don't have data to decide in which category it should be. That's kind of a sometimes a common theme in tropical ecosystems. Sometimes it's not applicable, but that's not important here. And then not evaluated, because in order to be considered for being on a species, it has to be evaluated, and we have not evaluated everything. Actually, we don't know everything. Okay, most of the biodiversity we don't know. That's the main problem. So we know perhaps 10% of the biodiversity that's out there. Only 10% of the species are known to science, usually. Okay, it varies from group to group, but that's usually. We estimate that we know only 10%. So there's 90% that we don't know. So if we don't know, we can't evaluate. Okay. So for Brazilian species, we have almost 50,000 species of plants cataloged. We only evaluated in terms of threat only 4,600. Okay, uh, like on less than 10%. Okay, and then of the 4,600 that we evaluated, 2,000, almost 2,100 are threatened. They fit in one of these three categories. So kind of half of them. Okay, so from the ones we evaluated, almost half of them are threatened. In terms of animals, we have 117,000 species cataloged, and then we evaluated 12,000 species. So we evaluated a lot more animals than plants. And you know, from these 12,000, we have 1,100 threatened. Okay, almost 10% threatened. So just to give you an idea of this. So today we have more than 3,000 species of plants and animals threatened with extinction in Brazil. When we look at this graph here, we see that these here are the animals, and then the plants here. So plants, flora, we have least concern, animals that we don't have to concern about in terms of threat. Here are the endangered, data deficient, vulnerable, and critically endangered, and nearly threatened. So critically endangered, vulnerable, and endangered are the three categories. In terms of animals, you see that most of them are least concern. Okay, a lot of them are data deficient. We don't know, and then this is the threatened animals here, and then near threatened here, just to give you a proportion of that. In terms of geography, this is the distribution of threatened plants and animals. You see here the Atlantic forest has a lot of species that are threatened, okay, which is, of course, also this also includes the coastal area, okay. But anyway, it makes sense that the Atlantic forest is the most destructed environment, and also more endangered species are in the Atlantic forest. The Cerrado also has some areas of concern, okay, as well as Eastern Amazonia, okay, which is the area of the Amazon that's most destructive. Here is a comparison among the different biomes. Here's the, terrestrial species. This is these two are animals and these two are plants. Okay, this is terrestrial on the left, and then this is freshwater species related to freshwater. Okay, of animals and plants. So if you think about animals, you see that the Atlantic forest has um, more species that are in one of the categories. So the green is least concern. Okay, the what we want to look is red, orange, and yellow. These are the three categories. And then there's the light green is near threatened, but I would focus on red, orange, and yellow. So you see that red, orange, and yellow are higher in the Atlantic forest, understandable again. But you see that the Caatinga has a significant number, even more than the Cerrado, okay? And the Amazon, of course, has less. When you look at freshwater, again, related species, same thing, Atlantic forest with more species and Caatinga second, okay? Um, Here for the plants, we have the same pattern, Atlantic forest with more endangered species or threatened species, sorry. And then Caatinga second, and then the Cerrado, then the Pampa, then the Amazon, okay? And for terrestrial plants, and then for freshwater related plants, again, the Atlantic forest, the Caatinga. So the message here is that the Atlantic forest um, has more endangered threatened species than the Caatinga, then the Cerrado, and, and then probably the Amazon and the Pampa and the Pantanal. Don't are smaller areas don't have that many species. Um, so just to finish up here, some trends in biodiversity conservation throughout the years. One important component are the conservation non-governmental organizations. Brazil has many that came up, especially in the 1980s, 1990s, and 2000s. So there are many organizations focusing on conservation of biodiversity. Okay, and they have an important role in many aspects of conservation, from uh, even collecting data, and like SOS Mata Atlântica has this atlas of the Atlantic forest with the protected areas and so forth. And we have many organizations that do environmental education, and also interactions with the local communities, and teaching about the importance for conservation. So this is something that's an important part of the ecosystem in Brazil, so to speak. Restoration is something that is very important, and it hasn't been done very often. But it's very important, especially in places like the Atlantic forest, which is mostly destroyed. This picture here shows the Fazenda Bulcão, the Bulcão farm in the state of Minas Gerais, which is owned by the famous photographer Sebastião Salgado and his family. This is the area in 2001 and the same area in 2019. You see that what they did was to reforest the area using native plants. So they planted seeds of the from and seedlings of species of the Atlantic forest, and were able to actually uh, reforest the species. This also brought animals to the area. They naturally came to the area to nest and to reproduce and to stay there. So now you have a much better situation after these 20 years. Okay, so restoration is important. We need more initiatives, especially in places like the Atlantic forest. Remote sensing and data science are very important. Like I mentioned before, the National Institute of Aerospace, INPE, and SOS Mata Atlântica have this incredible job of the Atlas of the Atlantic Forest, and they keep mapping Atlantic forest destruction and restoration throughout the years. They also the INPE also does a wonderful job in terms of mapping and forest fires, along with other initiatives, map biomas, and so several institutions involved in mapping destruction and fires in all biomes, the Amazon, the Cerrado. Um, Capacity building is important to prepare people to study and to protect biodiversity. We have many knowledge gaps. Like I mentioned before, we don't know much of our biodiversity, so we need to go out there and study, discover species. We have new species of plants and animals being described every day, almost every day. So some species might be going extinct before they're even described by science. Okay, so capacity building is an important component. Also, the combined effort by governments, federal government, state government, and municipal governments, and academia, civil society, the NGOs that I mentioned before, and also companies, businesses. Okay, it's important to have that. Although the interests are not the same usually, but it's important to have this connection between different sectors to achieve conservation goals. Another important factor are the indigenous peoples. Okay, like I mentioned, there are many areas, especially in the Amazon, that are indigenous reservations. Biodiversity also encompasses their culture, their way of life, their knowledge. You know, these people have an amazing knowledge of biodiversity, and we should learn from them definitely. But in order to do that, we have to protect them and their land. One of the uh, areas that are really target for illegal mining are indigenous lands, and also for logging. Illegal logging and mining are in the Amazon are especially done in indigenous lands. And finally, this idea that we need a sustainable development agenda, right? We need to combine our ideas about the importance of conserving biodiversity with um, the well-being of the people that are there. Okay, that's why we have the Sustainable Development Goals, which are promoted by the United Nations. The idea is that we have this 2030 agenda. So, and this started like 5 years ago. So we now have 10 years to meet the goals. Those are 17 goals, and with 169 um, targets that we have to achieve. And that includes not only biodiversity. So if we think about biodiversity, is basically here life below water and life on land. This is basically the whole of biodiversity that we have. But we also have connected things like climate action. Climate change is a real thing that's affecting not only biodiversity but also our lives. Um, Responsible consumption and production. This is a major problem, like we mentioned before, trash and plastics and all of that. That comes with sustainable cities and communities, and that's impossible if we don't have, if you don't uh, fight poverty and hunger. Okay, if we have people who are extreme poor and hungry, we're not going to be able to conserve biodiversity. Okay, so those are things that we have to, and also health and education and gender equality, and especially reducing inequalities. Okay, Brazil is a very unequal country in terms of population. Okay, have a concentration of richness in very few people, and then with that, it's very difficult to protect anything because you still have people living in very poor conditions, and we still, so we have to approach this from a more a broad view. Okay, that's kind of the message here, and I think that's kind of the message for the future. Okay, this is you've seen this before. You've seen parts of this. I use this in many of the presentations. This is a drawing by my daughter Sara Leite. She's a student in animation and digital arts at the university, at Federal University of Minas Gerais, and she did this drawing which I really like. It kind of captures the idea here. So that's why I use this for the for the course. Okay, so I think that's it. Let me stop the presentation and the recording too.